LLM evals aren't just about measuring performance. They also help you test improvements and see what works best. If you're deploying AI in a custom application, this video is for you. Part 1 described how to measure performance. Part 2 describes how to improve performance. In short, I'll describe how to create high-quality prompts from scratch and test whether they improve results. The key to getting good performance, if you're using LLMs at all, and this includes if you're using multimodal, I'll just do text-based LLMs today, maybe do multimodal in the future. The key is having high-quality examples. And often you just don't have any examples. Like maybe you have some data sets and books, but I wouldn't call them high-quality examples necessarily. Maybe the examples are in your head if you're trying to automate some task, or maybe the examples are in your customer's head and you somehow want to get them expressed so you can use them in few-shotting or for prompting. And I'm going to give you a systematic way to do that. And the question to answer is, how can we create great examples and then measure if including those examples or using them in the prompt actually improves performance? And we can do that because we have evaluation set up, as I described in part 1 of this video. So the overview, the approach rather I'm going to take is create some high quality examples. I'm going to start with 0 examples. I'm going to create some examples for my application, which will be answering questions on touch rugby, a rather obscure sport, but one you'll be familiar with on this channel as it gives a good example that LLMs are not too familiar with. I'll measure performance on those, and then I'm going to create extra examples. I don't mean extra high, I mean more high quality examples that I'm going to include in my prompts as few shot examples. And many of you will be familiar with the few shot prompting approach. And then I'll measure performance using those few shot examples and see if that helps out to score higher on my evaluations. And the key is here in generating these few shot examples that we're going to use LLMs to help us to make it quicker. And you'll see how I do that. So for the video, I'm going to spend the whole video pretty much walking through a demonstration of how I do all of these steps here. And I'm going to do it using the LLM Eval repo, which I showed in the first video. You can get lifetime access by going to trelis.com/advanced evals. But you should also just be able to do this yourself using ChatGPT or Cursor, some automated coding tool. I've actually built a nice UI that I'm going to use today. So I'll be going through a lot less code and trying to communicate the high level approach I'm taking for generating examples and testing if they improve performance. But this has become a lot easier thanks to these coding assistants. So if you're not in a position to buy lifetime access, I definitely recommend following the high level approach from this video using one of these coding assistants. And I will briefly come back at the end of the video to describe some final tips on how to think about preparing these data sets and ultimately improving performance for your application. So I've cloned the repo, the advanced evals repo, and I've run some installations, pip install requirements or UV pip install. I like using UV. And I have started up a database. I've left instructions here. It's the same instructions more or less as on part 1 of the video. And now I'm just running this web app here. So I'll just run from main. And that will bring me to this UI that I'm going to use today. And if you saw the first part of the video, you'll recognize here, it'll seem a little bit familiar, not because I had the UI, but because I emphasized thinking about data sets and thinking about pipelines. So a pipeline is a description of how you generate answers. And the way I think about it, it's what includes my system prompt. It includes any few shot examples. It includes the model I'm going to use. It includes the hyperparameters in the model. For example, the temperature or top K or top P. So it describes everything that you need in order to generate answers. And you want to have these pipelines, and then you can define different ones and tweak them and compare them using your evaluation. And your evaluation is going to run off the back of data sets you create. So we're going to create some data sets here. Now, rather than describing in too much detail what's all happening here, let me just start right away and create a pipeline that's going to allow me to generate answers, and then create a data set to see how well that pipeline is performing on the topic of touch rugby. So for the pipeline, I'll just click Add New Pipeline. Let's create a simple pipeline here with Claude Sonnet. So I'm just going to call it Simple Sonnet. And let's say Simple Pipeline with no system prompt or a few shot examples. This is how I recommend starting all the time. Just start with a plain LLM call that has nothing else included or optimized. I'll leave the version number as 1. And I'm going to select a provider here. I'll select Anthropic. Let me just increase my screen a little. And I'll select the latest Claude 3.5 model. I'm going to keep the parameters simple here and just start with a low temperature to try and get the highest accuracy. You could use a higher temperature if you use some sampling parameters, but I'm going to keep it simple with low temperature. Now later we'll come back here to include some few shot examples. I'll describe them later. But for now, we're just going to proceed and include no system message. So I'm fully defining my pipeline for generating answers just by selecting a model. And that's pretty much it. Maybe the temperature, I've selected the temperature too. So I'll save this configuration here. And I'm going to use this to help me in generating an initial data set. So my goal now is to create a data set and establish how well this pipeline is performing. And to do that, I have one here we'll talk about later, but let's start from scratch with a new simple touch rugby data set. So we just call it simple touch rugby. It's going to be created by me, and some simple Q&A requiring cited answers. So I'm going to be a bit more stringent on what I want from the model. I'm going to want it not just to get the answers correct, but also to give citations for its answers. And I'll actually want those citations to be in a specific format because I want to give you a feel for how you get models, not just to give the right answers, but to give you the right format. This is important in particular if you're using language models to create documents or to fill in documents, because they need to follow a structure. They can't just give you the right answer. It has to be structured the right way. And with that, I'm going to define an evaluation method. I talked a lot about this in part 1. I'm going to proceed with the criteria-based approach. If you don't know what that is, you're going to see in the next part, so don't worry. The other approach would be a ground truth-based approach. I prefer the criteria-based one because I think it is more flexible in capturing nuance. So I'm going to go with that. And now I have my data set created, and I'm going to start adding some tasks. So I'll just add 2 tasks here just to show you, for example, how I generate these data points. So first off, the data set, I think every task that you have, of course, there are many ways to do this, but the way I like to do it is when I define a task as part of a data set, I also define the documents that are included. Because ultimately, if I'm asking a question and there's a document available for that question, that document needs to be associated with that row of the data set. If I just define the questions and answers, and then somehow later, separately, when I evaluate, I need to associate the document, that starts to get confusing and disorganized. So I like having the documents described as part of the data set. So I'm specifying up front, here's all the information you have in order to answer this question. A similar example might be if you're working on a coding question, you want to set a coding question for evals. I would think you should define what the GitHub repo is that it has access to, for example. Okay, so here we have a document that can be added in, and it's possible to upload documents here, but the one that I want to include is the 5th edition rulebook. And by including this, it's essentially going to include the text. It's going to extract the text from this PDF and include the text in queries that are made. So when I do an evaluation, the document will be included there. Now, the question I'm going to ask here is, I'm going to say, is a forward pass a penalty, let's say a scrum, or a free kick? And it's actually a penalty tap, so I'm trying to mislead the model here. And for evaluation criteria, I'm going to say it's a penalty or a tap, which are the same thing. And I'll just put in brackets here. Actually, there are no scrums or free kicks in touch rugby. No need for the answer to say this, but if the answer, but I'll say, but clearly these are wrong answers. Okay, now additionally, I want to start defining the format. So I'll say correct responses should include a verbatim citation from the text, from the document, let's say. And I'll also say correct responses. The format to follow is, I'm going to give it the format here, and I'll just say brief answer. And then I'll say here, citation, and I'm going to say file name, section, x.x. I'll put here the quote. So you can see I'm being very precise on what criteria I want for this answer to be considered correct. Now notice I haven't even talked, well, I have talked about what the correct answer is, but I've also talked about the format that it's to follow. So I'm just defining criteria. Now this is actually enough to run evaluations. Yeah, so I can just submit like this. I don't actually need to go any further if I'm going to run an evaluation. I can save the task, and I have a task here that I'll be able to run an eval on. And I'll show you that, but I actually recommend going one step further to create a ground truth answer and also to run the judge to actually judge whether your answer is correct, because it gives you a sense for how well the judge is working on that question. So what I'm saying is it's actually good to intertwine the judging process with your dataset creation. It's going to reduce errors. It's going to improve the fidelity of the performance of your judge. So let's keep going. And you'll see there's a nice trick for generating a ground truth answer. Actually, I can use that simple pipeline to help me generate the answer. And furthermore, you might think this is cheating, but it makes sense. I'm going to include the evaluation criteria within the prompt. So I'm actually going to tell it what the right answer is. And now I'm going to run this pipeline, and it should generate an answer that's going to be fairly close. Yeah, you see, this is pretty much what I want. It's got the right format. It's got the quotation. And if you wanted, you could even check, maybe copy some of that and take a look at the document up here and check that it's there. It is there. That's good. But yeah, if this was not exactly right, you could edit it. Like maybe you want the citations to be listed like this. Maybe you want citations to be listed in some other way. You edit it here, and you can now save the answer up here, and it's going to save a ground truth answer. Now, ground truth is useful if you're going to do ground truth-based scoring. I recommend scoring actually with the evaluation criteria instead. But the reason it's valuable here to create the ground truth answer is because we can actually evaluate it with the judge right now. So I'm going to run the judge here. And what this is doing in the background is, I think it's using Claude Sonnet as well. So I've specified Claude Sonnet as the judge. We can just take a look here within the code very quickly. There's the criteria judge. It uses Claude 3.5 Sonnet. And you can look more at the prompt back in the first video. So part 1 of this series. Okay, so the judge is run. And what the judge is doing is it's checking the answer here, the ground truth answer. It's checking it against the criteria that we've defined, or that I've defined. And it's determining that it's correct in terms of the answer, the citation format, and it avoids the incorrect answers. So yeah, it's giving it a score of 1 out of 1. Now, you might think, is this a bit redundant? Because I'm using the LLM to generate the answer, and then I'm using the LLM to judge that answer against the criteria I used to create the answer. And the answer is no, not entirely. It's not necessarily the case that if you give the right criteria to an answer, that it's going to actually give you the answer formatted as you want. It's also not clearly the case that it would be judged correct. It's an open loop problem. So it is valuable to run through this process and check that when you judge using the judge you've set up, that it is passing. Now, maybe it fails. Sometimes I run these and they fail, and I have to adjust my criteria, and I might have to rerun to get a better ground truth answer, or just the criteria needed to be more clear in order for the answer to pass. So I'm going to save this task now, and I know I have one good data point here. Now I'm going to do a second one really quickly. So I'll add in a document, the same one here, and I'm going to ask a hard question here, which will be how many players on the field at the start of a drop-off. And the answer is 4 players per team. And I'm going to again say what the format should be. Correct answers should provide verbatim citations. The answer format should be, and I'll say brief answer, and then I'll say citations, file name, section, quotation. Okay, it's roughly the same. That should be fine. I'm going to create a correct answer. And then once that's done, I'm going to evaluate the answer. So let's take a look. This looks good. And now run the judge. And it scores 1 out of 1. So this looks fine. So I'll save the task. And now I have 2 tasks in my data set. Okay, so what we can do at this point is, let's say you've probably generated 20 questions at this point. You've got a big enough data set that you're measuring performance across your application. 2 questions is probably not enough. But what you can do now is select a pipeline and run an evaluation. So this is just going to run those 2 questions with that pipeline I defined, which is a simple pipeline, and see how many it scores. And when it's finished scoring them, we'll be able to check why it has scored the questions in that way, including the prompt traces and including the judge's reasoning on why it passed or not. So it fails both of those, and we can check out why it fails. So here is the question, here's the answer, and it says here, forward pass results in a penalty to the defending team, which looks pretty good. And just note that if you check out the model prompt, you'll see that the model is actually receiving the document because that's what's defined in the data set. And you can see the question here is the forward pass a scrum or a free kick? And here's the answer. But let's see why the judge marks it wrong. And the judge says the answer correctly states, it doesn't state extra information, so that's fine. But it asks for a verbatim citation from the document in a specific format. And yeah, it doesn't follow the exact format. So for that reason, this is failing. Now let's quickly look at the second question here. And let's see, in this question here, the judge says the answer is correct. The answer includes a relevant citation, but it doesn't follow the strictly required format. And so, yeah, we can now think about ways to improve this. And broadly speaking, there are 2 ways to do this. There are probably more, but there are at least 2. One is we can adjust the system prompt. So we can prompt the model to respond in a certain format. And if it's a good instruction following model, it's probably going to follow that. So we could, for example, just take a copy of this here, and we could see if it gets that correct just by putting it in as a system prompt. So just to be specific here, if I go to the pipeline, if I edit the pipeline, I can modify the system message template to say something like respond in the following format, like this, with a brief answer and the file name. And yeah, I think Claude is likely to fix the format if I do this, because it's a very good instruction following model. The issue is, what if you have an application where you have different formats that are required for different questions? So some of the questions, they might want to be formatted like this, but maybe some of the questions might be formatted as a long answer. Maybe you don't want citations for some of the others. So what I'm saying is you have different formats for different questions. And in that case, you're not able to give a generic system prompt that's going to capture all of those cases. But what you can do is you can include various examples that are different. So you could have an example provided in the system prompt where there's a citation. You could have one where there's no citations. You could have one that has a long answer, a short answer, different formats. So using these few shot examples is one way you can have some diversity. Now, it's going to again depend on the strength of the model, whether it's able to not be confused by too many few shot examples. But actually, with strong models, you can really put in a lot of few shot examples without causing issues. And I've one side note to make on O1 that I will comment on at the end, because O1 is quite a different beast. Okay, so method 1 is you can use a system message. Method 2 is you can create some few shot examples. Here, I'm going to now create some few shot examples, and I actually do it the very same way as I set evaluation questions. So I start by picking the document I want to include, then by asking a question. I'm going to say, how long is each half in touch rugby? And I'm going to say here 20 minutes. And I'm actually going to just copy in the rest of the criteria. So let me duplicate that tab, go back to datasets, and I'm going to copy what I've got for the rest of the eval criteria. So let's copy this here. And now we'll select the simple pipeline include the criteria so we can generate a response. And this here looks good. Run the judge. And now one step that's going to be different is if this passes, which it has to pass, otherwise the program won't allow you to save it as a training example. If it passes, I'm going to mark it as a training example. And what this does is it makes it available. It doesn't immediately include it in a pipeline, but it makes it available to pipelines to include as a few shot example. And furthermore, it removes it from any evaluations. So if I save this task now, when I run evaluations on this data set, it's not going to run the training example, but it will run these two examples. Rather, it's made the training example available so that it can be included as a prompt, as a few shot prompt example. Now I'm just going to make one more very quickly, so I have at least two examples to include as few shot. And the question here I'm going to ask is, I'm going to say how many touches before a change in possession if a player intercepts a ball from the other team. And the answer is 6 touches. Note that this is one more than the usual 5 touches and change of possession on the 6th. So yeah, if you intercept, you get a 0th touch, so you effectively get an extra touch. And so I'm going to mark this here. And I'm also going to put in this requirement here around the answer. And now I'm going to generate my sample answer, and then I will judge it. Now let's see if it gets this right. So yeah, it's counted as 0 touch, so to get a full set of 6 touches. That's good. And then I'm going to run the judge. And if it gets this right, I'm going to include it now. It does get it right. Content citation, everything looks good. I'm going to include it as a training example. And now I have a data set with 2 eval examples and 2 training examples. So with these training examples, I'm able to add them to a new pipeline. And actually a quick way to make a new pipeline is just to take an existing pipeline. And when I save this, it will actually save it as a copy. So I'm going to say Sonnet touch rugby. And I'm going to say few shot. And this one here is going to have a system prompt and few shot examples. Now, same thing for the model, the temperature, but this time you can see out of the data set I made, this is an older data set here, but out of the data set I made, there are 2 questions available to include as few shot, and I can preview them here if I want. Of course, the questions have the documents included, so the question is right at the bottom here. It has a ground truth and the evaluation criteria. And I can select these examples so they'll be included in the prompt. And I can also put a system message. You are an expert on 5th edition touch rugby rules. Okay, and I'll save that configuration. So now if I go to pipelines, you can see I have the simple Sonnet pipeline and I have Sonnet touch rugby few shot. And now that will appear, if I go into my data set, it will appear as an option here to run an evaluation. So I'm going to run the evaluation now with a slightly better system prompt, but mostly the inclusion of these few shot examples. And note that in the system prompt, I didn't define the format to respond to, but I did give some few shot examples. So I'm hoping that because the few shot examples are there, it's going to follow the format that I laid out. So that's finished now, and we can view the details. And yeah, it looks like they've both passed. And we can check out, let's look at the model prompt first. So you can see, I'll show you where I'm putting these examples. I've got my system message, but then I've got below some examples that demonstrate the expected format, style, and quality of responses. Use these as a guide for how to structure your answers and maintain consistent quality. Then I have a question. I've the context here of the document. And this is important actually. If you do this with really long documents and put in a lot of few shot examples, you're going to run out of context pretty quickly. So, I mean, one option is you can just put in the full document, but what I do is I truncate the middle of the document. Now, that definitely makes the few shot example a bit weaker, but it obviously makes it more compact. So you need to think about your cost. How much money do you want to pay for longer context? Does everything fit into the context anyway or not? If you can, ideally, you would include all the context. But yeah, you can always maybe truncate the middle and see if it works. So I also include here in the examples the evaluation criteria. And then you can see they're not just one examples, they're separated by these triple dash. There's a second example that's included here. Now, I've shown these here just kind of as plain text. Actually, in the background, I've put XML tags around them to make sure they're more clearly delineated. So I've XML tags for each example. And then I even have XML tags to delineate between the document portion, the question portion, the evaluation criteria portion, and then the answer portion. So yeah, here you can see is the start of the messages after the system message. So in the messages, I have the document, which is the first part of the user message. It's the first text element. And then the second text element is the question here. Is it a forward pass or a scrum? That's my second text element here. Okay, so yeah, the model gets this correct. It identifies its penalty. It's got a citation, and it avoids stating incorrect options. And yeah, I mean, here's the answer. It's got the short statement. It's got the quotation. And a citation here. So now if I wanted to be a bit more strict on this, I could start to include guidance on how long the answer should be here. Like maybe this answer is too long, but I don't explicitly penalize that in my criteria. So if I wanted it to be shorter, I would have to do that. Okay, let's look quickly at the second task. So here, the model answer drop-off starts with 4 players, and then it gives this citation. So it's matching everything correctly. If you want to see the judge prompt, by the way, all of the judge prompt goes in the system message. Again, this is covered in video 1. And the judge is trained. Here's an example I give to the judge to make sure it follows the format. It's encouraged to provide this explanation and then a score. And so here we pass in the question, the evaluation criteria, the model's answer, and then we ask the judge to score and explain, which it does. It explains, and then it scores here. So this brings us through round circle, or the full circle. So I've shown you how to set up an initial data set, evaluate performance, see if it's any good, then create some few shot examples and add those few shot examples into a pipeline. Now, you can play around with the pipelines. You can easily change the model provider. You could use OpenAI, you could use Google. You could use, for example, the latest Gemini 2 Flash model. You could try out OpenAI's O1. I will make a few comments on O1 in a minute because things are a little bit different. And you can also change the system message if you want to provide some general guidance that's going to affect all of your generations. And of course, you can create a different pipeline for a different system message. In fact, I would recommend that so that you then can save the history of the results. And that's the last thing I'll say here, which is that if you want to check out for a given data set, you can view the evaluations and just see the history. So you can see here that Sonnet Touch Rugby Few has got 2 out of 2 correct. And then the simpler one we ran earlier got 0 out of 2 correct. So some final tips here. First off, on judges, I did cover this a lot more at previous day, but a few other thoughts. You'll notice I used the criteria judge, and the criteria judge will score every answer either 0 or 1. Now, you can customize the judge, create a new judge. It's you should think of each judge as a pipeline as well. So the judge has got its model, it's got its temperature, it's got its system prompt. But I would recommend definitely at the start to keep the judge very simple and actually do that binary approach. Once you start moving to grading 0 to 10, things like that, you start running into more noise and you get into the questions of, well, what's a 7, what's a 4? And I think that adds an extra layer, especially when you've low levels of data. It's favorable to keep things as simple as possible. And it also forces you to be very accurate in describing your criteria and making sure that it doesn't fail, or it does fail if you want it to fail. Anyway, I recommend keeping it simple for the judge. For managing examples, as you saw I did and the UI does, it's really important to keep your training and eval data separate. I know that's maybe an obvious point, but you need some mechanism like I have where if you designate a sample as being a training example, it should nowhere else appear as an eval example. Because otherwise it's just going to cause contamination and you think you're getting good performance, but it's really because you're feeding in the training example. The next one is, I recommend manually picking which examples are training. So the way I would think about it is create a data set to measure evaluation. And when you're creating training examples, you want to create examples that are kind of similar to the ones you're going to evaluate on so that you don't underfit, but also they shouldn't be exactly the same, because if they're exactly the same, then you're going to overfit in your evaluation. So for that reason, I don't recommend just taking an eval split. I know that's a common thing to do for fine tuning, and it probably works well if you've got a lot of data, but I think in a lot of cases here, you don't have a lot of data. So just picking, like hand selecting which ones are training is a good idea. A few quick notes. I'll talk about O1 briefly then. Yeah, if you're building UIs like I just showed here, a few quick tips. I recommend using Cursor, or maybe you can do it in Replit or something like that. I think seeing the code is useful if you're using a database like Postgres. I often will tell Cursor when I'm starting to use no React. That's partly because I'm terrible at React, but also React has got a more complicated file structure and it can lead to more difficulty in debugging compared to having a simpler kind of HTML type app. For the database, I recommend keeping it simple. For example, I'll often ask it to just use pure SQL queries rather than using Alembic for managing the database, which requires you to define the model, or SQL Alchemy for interacting with it. Those are good tools and they'll allow you to more systematically upgrade or downgrade your databases. But actually the raw SQL, again, for debugging, it can just be a bit simpler. So the last thing, and it is important, I want to say a few things about O1. O1 is the reasoning model from OpenAI. I suppose F1 from Fireworks, or is it OR1 from DeepSeek? Those are also reasoning models. Reasoning models, very briefly, they are going to use multiple requests either in series or in parallel to answer a question. Usually they will have multiple answers and they'll have a verifier to pick out the best one, or they'll have an answer that backtracks if it finds a mistake and moves forward. But when you use these reasoning models, they do give better reasoning answers. They tend to be confused by having longer amounts of context. And I don't necessarily have a good fundamental explanation for why that is. But if you read the OpenAI guidelines, so here are the OpenAI guidelines, and you can see the advice is actually specific in the case of these reasoning models. So yeah, I'm in the reasoning models. And the advice here is keep prompts simple and direct, and avoid few-shot learning or instructing the model to think step by step. So I have two comments on this. One is I had a lot of trouble today, even without using few-shot, to get O1 to respond to my queries. When I would try query O1 Mini or O1 Preview, I would fail due to network issues. And that may just be a temporary issue that's there with OpenAI. I actually had some similar issues with GPT-4o Mini, or it may be something silly I'm doing. But as I understand, if you send in a lot of context, that is going to confuse the model. And that includes putting in long documents. I think there can be difficulties in doing the reasoning across there. So that definitely reduces in some case the utility if it's not possible to do those long context queries. Maybe it's just the thing with the API, because I've been trying with ChatGPT and things work a bit better when I use the ChatGPT interface itself. So maybe in a later video, I can test out a bit more the performance of OpenAI, because I'm particularly interested in how it does in finding things like inconsistencies in documents. When it comes to few-shot prompting, yes, that is going to be a drawback if you can't few-shot prompt, because fundamentally you need to pass in examples if you expect examples of a certain format to be produced by your model. There isn't really any other way to guide the model towards that. So what that might mean is a compound system where you specifically use O1 for doing reasoning parts of the problem, but then when you want to structure a response that takes a specific format or requires a lot of documentation, maybe you need to have the traditional transformer, the pure model without sampling within your compound system. So those are my notes on O1. I'll put a link up to this in the video here. And that's pretty much it for this part 2 on evaluations. I am planning to continue the series, so let me know your thoughts below on anything you'd like me to cover in the next series of videos. I know agents is one thing that would be particularly useful to allow within the pipeline, as would RAG retrieval, to include that within a pipeline for evaluation. And as usual, let me know if you have any questions on this video here today. Cheers, folks.